600 legionaries massacred every minute. Plus 70,000 dead. This was not a battle, it was an annihilation. On August 2nd, 216 BC, the massive Roman army met Hannibal's smaller force near Cannae, expecting a quick victory. But the Carthaginian general had a plan, a deliberate retreat, a psychological trap in one of history's first pincer movements. The stage for this monumental confrontation was set near the quiet, unassuming village of Cannae, nestled in the sun-baked plains of southeastern Italy. The date, the 2nd of August in the year 216 before Christ, would become a day of permanent infamy for the Roman Republic. This engagement was not merely a skirmish, it was a key decisive battle of the Second Punic War, the titanic struggle for dominance between the land-based power of Rome and the maritime empire of Carthage. Outrunning, at the head of the Carthaginian forces was a man whose very name would become a specter to haunt Roman children for generations, Hannibal Barca. Opposing him stood the joint commanders of the Roman Republic's consular army, Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro. They led a combined force of unprecedented size, a legionary army that was vastly superior in numbers to Hannibal's. The Roman strategy was one of blunt force, a clear objective to seek out and destroy the Carthaginian invader. Sorna, Hannibal's strategy was one of profound complexity, aiming not just for victory, but for total psychological annihilation. For the other side, it would be remembered as one of the darkest, most humiliating, and most catastrophic defeats ever suffered by Rome. It was not a homogeneous national force, but a complex multi-ethnic coalition, a mosaic of warriors drawn from every corner of Carthage's sphere of influence. In total, Hannibal's forces may have numbered between 40,000 and 50,000 men. This was a significant numerical disadvantage against the massive host Rome had fielded. The infantry, the core of his army, was a diverse mix. It included approximately 8,000 battle-hardened Libyans, 5,500 Gautulans, 16,000 Gauls, tall, fierce warriors from the north, and 8,000 Hispanics, a group which itself included Iberians, Celtiberians, and Lusitanians. This diverse body was held together by loyalty to Hannibal and the promise of victory. Beyond this main body, Hannibal possessed specialized units that would prove critical. A contingent of 2,000 Balearic slingers was present. These men were mercenaries renowned throughout the ancient world for their terrifying accuracy and the lethal force of their projectiles. A unique and demoralizing element of this army was noted by the historian Polybius. He observed that some of Hannibal's soldiers, particularly his African infantry, were equipped with arms and armor stripped from Roman soldiers defeated in previous battles, such as Trebia and Lake Trasimene. It remains a subject of historical debate whether this referred only to defensive equipment like shields and armor, or if it included Roman offensive weapons as well. However, a general interpretation suggests it referred to the entire panoply of Roman gear, and perhaps even the adoption of Roman tactical organization. This adaptability, this willingness to use the enemy's own strengths against them, was a core tenet of Hannibal's genius. The trap itself was set by the deployment. The conventional military doctrine of the era was straightforward and universally accepted place. Your infantry in the center to hold the line and station your cavalry on the two flanking wings to protect them and seek an advantage. The Romans under the command of Varro followed this convention closely. They believed in their system, they believed in the unmatched power of the legion, but they made a fateful modification. Instead of extending their numerically superior line to overlap and envelop the Carthaginian front, they chose to add additional depth. Their maniples were arrayed in a dense, deep column designed for one purpose: to act as a human battering ram and smash through the center of Hannibal's line. This decision was driven by recent history. Consul Varro was keenly aware that Roman infantry had successfully penetrated Hannibal's center at the Battle of Trebia. His entire strategy was to replicate this one success, but on a scale still greater. Somewhat, this created a critical vulnerability. Despite outnumbering the Carthaginians, this depth-focused deployment meant the Roman front line was approximately the same size as their numerically inferior opponents. Knowing they had willingly sacrificed their greatest advantage, breadth, for a concentrated, narrow punch. The typical style of ancient warfare was this continuous, grinding push in the center, an effort to dominate the enemy through sheer mass and pressure. But Hannibal knew this. He understood the Roman mind, their tactics, and their arrogance. He took his outnumbered army, and rather than meeting this dense column head-on, he placed them strategically around the enemy with the express purpose of achieving a tactical victory. As the two armies advanced, Hannibal meticulously arranged his trap. He gradually extended the center of his line, pushing his Spanish and Gallic troops forward. Polybius described this formation as a crescent, bulging outward toward the advancing Romans. This was the bait. These troops were his weakest. On their flanks, held back and angled away in echelon formation, were his elite African troops. The Romans saw only the bulging, seemingly weak center. It was exactly the target they were looking for. The trap was set. The battle commenced not with the infantry clash, but with a ferocious, swirling melee on the flanks as the cavalry forces collided. This was the first phase of Hannibal's plan to clear the board of Rome's protectors. On one wing, the heavy Carthaginian cavalry, comprised of Spaniards and Celts, smashed into the Roman cavalry. The fighting was immediate and brutal. Polybius noted that the engagement was so fierce and the space so confined that many of the Spanish and Celtic horsemen dismounted from the saddle. They voluntarily abandoned their mounts to fight the Roman equestrians on foot, turning the cavalry battle into a desperate, hacking brawl. He labeled the fight barbaric in its total brutality. There was no room for sophisticated maneuvers, only for close-quarters destruction. The Carthaginian horsemen, fighting with this desperate fury, quickly took the lead. They shattered the Roman formations, broke their morale, and tore down their opponents without pity. The Roman cavalry on this flank ceased to exist as a coherent force. On the opposite flank, a different drama unfolded. Here, Hannibal's light, agile Numidian cavalry engaged the Roman allied cavalry. In Onidiri, the Numidians were masters of skirmishing, riding without saddles and hurling javelins with deadly accuracy. They did not commit to a decisive charge. Instead, they engaged in such a way as to simply keep the Roman allied cavalry occupied. They feinted, retreated, harassed, and drew the allies into a frustrating, inconclusive fight that effectively pinned them in place and neutralized them. Attacked from both sides, one shattered, one neutralized. The Roman cavalry support broke. The victorious Numidians then pursued them, even off the battlefield. The first part of the trap had sprung. The Roman infantry was now advancing, totally blind and unprotected on both flanks. As the cavalry battles reached their grim conclusions, the massive formations of heavy infantry in the center of the field advanced toward each other. This was the moment the Roman consuls had gambled everything on. The earth shook from the tread of more than 100,000 men. But as the Romans marched, insidious, non-human factors began to take their toll. A sudden wind began to blow from the east, the Volturnus. Swept across the dry, dusty plain and threw dust into the faces of the Romans. A gritty, blinding cloud that obscured their vision. Sonar, the Carthaginians, with their backs to the wind, were largely unaffected. While the wind itself was not the deciding factor, the dust that was raised by the march of two great armies was potentially debilitating to the sight. Roman legionaries squinted, their eyes watering, unable to clearly see the enemy line or even their own standards. This dust, however, was not the only psychological factor at play. A second, more debilitating disadvantage was a thirst that plagued the Roman ranks. And this was not an accident of the hot August day. It was a direct result of Hannibal's planning. An attack by Hannibal on the Roman camp during the previous day had specifically targeted and disrupted their water supplies. Furthermore, the enormous number of troops packed into the valley created an overwhelming bustle. And they were thirsty, they were tired, and they were half blind. All these psychological factors made the battle especially difficult for the very infantrymen upon whom Rome's entire strategy depended. The engagement began. Light infantry from both sides skirmished in the center, a brief indecisive exchange with few casualties, before they quickly retreated through the ranks of their heavy infantry. Now the main lines met. This was the decisive moment. Hannibal, knowing of the superiority of the Roman infantry, had given his center line of Spaniards and Gauls a counter-intuitive and terrifying order. He had ordered his infantry to deliberately retreat. As the massive, deep Roman column slammed into them, the Carthaginian crescent buckled. So, it bent backward. The Romans roared in perceived triumph. This was it. The enemy center was breaking. Machina. They surged forward, pouring more and more men into the gap. But the Carthaginian line was not breaking. It was inverting. It was creating a still narrower semicircle around the attacking Roman forces. By doing this, Hannibal had considerably weakened the Roman infantry. As the first ranks advanced gradually, the main body of the Roman troops began to lose their cohesion. They became so compacted in their eagerness to exploit the gap that they hardly had space to wield their weapons. In their desire to finish off the retreating Hispanic line, the Romans had ignored the Carthaginian troops that remained unengaged on the ends of this now inverted crescent. This deliberate slow retreat also gave the Carthaginian cavalry time to drive off the Roman cavalry on both flanks and to begin their ride to attack the Roman center in the rear. The trap was now fully sprung. The Roman infantry, now stripped of protection on both flanks, had formed itself into a wedge that was driving deeper and deeper into the Carthaginian semicircle, literally conducting itself into a dead end. At this, the decisive point, Hannibal gave his final command. He ordered his African infantry to turn inward and advance against the Roman flanks. This simultaneous attack from both sides created an encirclement, one of the first known examples of a pincer movement in history. The Romans, pressed shoulder to shoulder, could not turn to face this new threat. Panic, swift and total, began to ripple through the ranks. At that exact moment, the Carthaginian cavalry attacked the Romans from the rear. Forward, the advance of the Roman infantry was abruptly halted. They were attacked from the left by the African infantry. Sodershum, they were attacked from the right by the African infantry. And they were attacked from the rear by the cavalry. The Romans were locked in trapped without a way to escape. The battle was over. What followed was simple, systematic execution. At this point, prior to the carnage, the Carthaginian forces raised a wall of shields and spears around the trapped mass and began to massacre them systematically. There was no room for valor. There was no room for defense. The Roman soldiers, pinned by their own comrades, could barely lift their arms. Historians claim that almost 600 legionaries were massacred every minute. This horrific mechanical work continued for hours until darkness put an end to the bloodshed. Of the massive Roman army, only 14,000 soldiers finally managed to escape. Among them was a young tribune named Scipio, who would later be known as Scipio Africanus. The historian Polybius writes that of the Roman and allied infantry, about 70,000 men fell, while 10,000 were captured. He notes that perhaps about 3,000 finally managed to escape. Even the escapees were not safe. About 2,000 Roman fugitives were detained in the unfortified village of Cannae by Carthaginian cavalry. The cost to the victors was not insignificant. Livy noted Hannibal's losses at about 8,000 of his best men, while Polybius reported 5,700 casualties. These losses were primarily from the Spanish and Gallic center, the bait that had absorbed the Roman charge. The disparity is chilling: 8,000 Carthaginians at most, in exchange for 70,000 dead Romans and 10,000 captured. This was one of the most crushing defeats that Rome suffered in its entire history. It was also an event that demonstrated the tactical ingenuity of the Carthaginian general Hannibal Barca. He had taken a smaller, diverse army and used it to utterly destroy a larger, more conventional foe. He did this by subverting their expectations. He understood their doctrine, their reliance on the central push, and their arrogance. He used their own strength, their desire to push forward against them, turning their depth from an asset into a fatal liability that compacted them. The Battle of Cannae remains the quintessential example of a perfect tactical victory, a day when strategy and intellect completely triumphed over brute force and superior numbers. Let us delve deeper into the mechanics of this systematic massacre, for the genius of the plan is matched only by the horror of its execution. The Roman strategy conceived by Varro was fundamentally flawed because it was one-dimensional. It relied entirely on the hypothesis that a sufficiently deep column of infantry could break any center presented to it. To Russia, this was a strategy of brute force, lacking any subtlety or contingency. This depth-oriented deployment was in fact the primary cause of the defeat. It created the very conditions necessary for the Roman army to be compacted. A line that is too deep loses all flexibility. The men in the rear ranks cannot see the battle. Their only role was to push forward, adding their weight to the wedge. They become a blind driving piston. Hannibal did not just anticipate this, he counted on it. His deliberate retreat was an invitation, a welcome mat laid out for the Roman wedge. The brilliance of the plan was in its component parts, each one critical to the whole. Connor, first the elimination of the cavalry. By destroying the Roman cavalry and chasing them from the field, Hannibal accomplished two goals. He stripped the Roman infantry of its protection on both flanks, and he freed his own cavalry to become the hammer that would strike the Roman rear. Without this cavalry superiority, the encirclement would have been incomplete. Through second, the psychological warfare. The thirst and the lack of rest ensured the Roman infantry entered the fight already weakened. The dust and wind served to obscure their vision, increasing confusion and preventing the Roman officers from seeing the trap that was forming on their flanks. They were fighting in a state of sensory deprivation, able to perceive only the retreating enemy in front of them. Suri, third, the pincer movement itself. The African infantry held in reserve on the flanks were Hannibal's elite. They were disciplined. They had to watch as the entire Roman army surged past them, trusting that their commander's plan was sound. Elmar, their turn inward was a perfectly timed maneuver, slamming into the exposed, unarmored sides of the Roman legionaries. Sorelua, the Romans trapped in their deep formation could not turn to fight them. The final attack to the rear by the cavalry was the sealing of the tomb. It abruptly halted the Roman advance and triggered the final catastrophic compression. The 600 legionaries. Surina, they were not fighting, they were being harvested. The carnage was the result of thousands of men being trapped in a space too small for them to wield their weapons, surrounded by enemies who had ample room to kill. Cannae was not just a battle, it was a tactical feat of unrivaled genius, an annihilation that proved in the most brutal way possible that a superior mind is the most dangerous weapon on any battlefield. The defeat was so crushing that it shook the Roman Republic to its core, leaving a scar that would define its history for decades to come. The analysis of the why must extend beyond the mere movements on the field. Cueillon, it must encompass the philosophies of the commanders. Somar, Gaius Terentius Vero, the primary architect of the Roman plan, was a product of a system that believed in Roman invincibility. His plan to recreate the success at Trebia on a still greater scale demonstrates a lack of imagination, a failure to understand that his opponent Hannibal was not a man who would make the same mistake twice. Varro saw the conventional deployment not as a set of principles, but as a rigid formula. Saprit, his one innovation adding depth was simply an attempt to apply more force to this formula. He failed to appreciate the trade-offs. By sacrificing breadth for depth, he ensured his numerically superior army would have a front of approximately the same size as Hannibal's. Surprenantly, he had willingly nullified his single greatest advantage before the first sword was drawn. He created a blunt instrument, a battering ram, and aimed it at what he perceived as the weakest point. Hannibal, by contrast, was an artist of the battlefield. He understood that the typical style of ancient warfare was this continuous push into the center. He knew the Romans led their battles in this way. His entire strategy was a direct counter to this predictability. He placed his outnumbered army strategically around the enemy, precisely to obtain a tactical victory. It was not a static line, it was a dynamic, flexible trap. Its weak center was its most important feature. It was designed to do one thing: deliberately retreat. This deliberate retreat was the engine of the entire battle. It controlled the pace. It controlled the location of the fight. It pulled the Romans deeper and deeper into the Carthaginian semicircle. It forced the Romans to lose their cohesion and become so compacted they hardly had space to wield their weapons. This is the central irony of Cannae. The Romans lost because they thought they were winning. Their very desire to finish off the retreating enemy led them to ignore the uncommitted African troops on their flanks. They charged past the very men who would soon encircle and destroy them. The pincer movement was not just a flanking attack, it was the inevitable consequence of the Romans' own forward momentum. Hannibal used the Roman army's own strength and aggression as the force that would ultimately destroy it. The carnage and systematic slaughter that followed was the grim harvest of this intellectual supremacy. 7,000 fallen were a testament not just to Carthaginian prowess, but to Roman rigidity. The crushing defeat was a lesson written in blood on the vital importance of adaptability, a lesson that the survivor, Scipio Africanus, would one day use against Hannibal himself. Cannae remains the worst defeat in Roman history, but also the greatest tactical feat in military history, demonstrating forever the tactical ingenuity of Hannibal Barca.